Hello and welcome, friends. I hope everybody's having a great day so far. If you are new here, welcome. And if you're back, welcome back. I greatly appreciate all of the ongoing support. This is my channel, Dragonsjewel Creative Gems, and I'm Tegan. And I'm just going to get all those wonderful YouTubey stuff out of the way. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing so. It's just down below. And if you like the content, please make sure you're hitting the like button on the videos. And of course, if you want to share some love down in the comments below, it's always greatly appreciated. And I absolutely love reading them. I do my best to make sure that I respond back and share some love in your direction as well, because naturally without you, this channel wouldn't exist. And I appreciate each and every one of you. And I thought I would bring some of those Halloween spooky vibes to the channel. There are going to be in the WIP and Chat style format, but I'm going to read some ghost stories of Alberta, which is the province that I reside in. So I will have a spooky canvas that I'll be working on, and then I'm going to read a couple of ghost stories so that you can listen along while you dab and paint, or work on another craft, or what you normally do during WIP and Chats kind of thing, and I keep you company with some spooky tales from my province. So I figured that would be fun. Knocking around in a trapper's cabin. The Fort McMurray area has a turbulent history. Its weather is harsh, and the area has been severely affected by Alberta's boom-bust economy. So the faint-hearted don't settle there. When the economy boomed, little communities sprung up around oil sands plants. These instant towns usually adopted a frontier mentality, and life's little necessities were neither available nor desired. In the early 1970s, all that remained of one such neighborhood was an abandoned trapper's cabin. A native elder from the area reports that at one time the land the cabin sat on was a temporary home to about 100 people. Apparently they were a violent, hard-drinking group who were known to settle their differences in a very permanent way. Several murders were committed while the shanty town was in existence. On a frigid November evening in 1974, two trappers were relieved to come across an abandoned cabin. They were on a trek to town for supplies that they were going to camp out, but it turned colder and the shelter was a comforting sight. Even the trappers' dogs would be protected for the night, as the cabin was surrounded with small outbuildings. As soon as they settled the dogs, the two went about making themselves at home. It was bitterly cold in the tiny house. Colder, it seemed, than it was outside. They built a fire that should take the frost out of the air in no time, they thought. Unfortunately, no matter what they did, they could not raise the temperature of the little peaked roof building. They were not men who were accustomed to luxury, and they dealt with the heating problem in a typically matter-of-fact way. They tucked into their bedrolls and looked forward to a good night's sleep. No sooner had they put their heads down than they clearly heard the distinctive sound of wood being chopped. Assuming they were very much alone in the area, the sounds were puzzling. Trappers left their beds and headed out to look around. Nothing could be seen or heard despite a thorough search. There were not even any tracks in the snow. The dogs had been completely silent, and this caused the men to blame the sound of chopping on their imaginations. A quick check of the dogs did nothing to reassure the pair that this was a correct assumption. Like their masters, these dogs had not been used to an easy existence, and yet they were crouched down and shivering, clearly frightened. No amount of talking to them or patting them offered any relief for their obvious fright. Deciding there was nothing else they could reasonably do, the trappers returned to the cabin in hopes of sleeping. As soon as they did, the sounds of chopping could be heard coming from just outside the cabin. Again they went outside and searched, and again they could find nothing. After 3 or 4 fruitless searches, it was decided that one would sleep while the other stayed awake, watching out for intruders. Every time the trapper appointed to the position of guard would put his head down, the chopping would start up again, and every time he went outside to investigate, it would cease. This pattern continued until the poor men, totally unnerved, collapsed into a fitful but exhausted slumber. When they awoke in the morning, all was quiet and the dogs were tranquil. Despite the calm, the men had had more than enough of the cabin. Without bothering to fix breakfast, the two men harnessed their dogs and fled toward town. In 1984, the trappers were quoted as saying they would never spend another night in the cabin, and that the experience was one they hoped never to encounter again. An area of concentrated suffering. There is little point in denying it. Monica Field of the Frank Slide Interpretive Center commented when asked if the area is haunted. This is an area of such concentrated suffering. The only place I've ever been that I felt that suffering as intensely was the Tower of London. The Crow's Nest Pass area was coal mining country in Alberta's early days. Hard living and inadequate safety precautions snuffed out a number of lives prematurely. But mass tragedy was the result of the worst and most dramatic events. 3 tiny towns were devastated between the years 1903 and 1914. April 29, 1903, while most of the town of Frank slept, almost the entire side of nearby Turtle Mountain crashed down. The avalanche is estimated to have taken only a minute and a half. It killed at least 76 people. Very few bodies were ever recovered, and the lethal rocks remained where they fell, forming a mass headstone. There has never been any attempt to remove the detritus. Today, an interpretive center details the tragedy and explains that the strange geography and geology surrounding the area are monuments to the destructive power of nature. Death toll may have been far higher than the recorded figure. An accurate count will never be possible because all the town's records were buried with the bodies, and the boom town of Frank had a constantly shifting population. 50 men had apparently arrived in Frank the day before. It isn't known whether they continued on to the neighboring town of Blairmore, or if they were killed by the slide as they lay in makeshift tents. The details that are known are perhaps even more surprising. In Frank Anderson's book about the tragedy, he lists what families lived in which houses, and in many cases, the names and ages of the children, as well as the occasional bit of family history. It is also known that 17 men were rescued from the mine and 23 from the town. The slide is an unnerving sight, especially at night, Monica explained. These violent deaths have left an aura over the area. Even in daylight, it's eerie. Many people report having seen shapes or forms. With a first-hand viewing of the Frank Slide site, it is impossible not to share that opinion. The horror that was felt that spring night, nearly a century ago, has left a lasting scar, not only on the landscape, but in the ambience of the area under the shadow of Turtle Mountain. Oddly, the most commonly accepted ghost in the town of Frank was no association with the tragedy of the slide. It is the ghost of Monty Lewis, the local madame. She was known for her great individuality, especially the jewelry she loved and wore constantly, even to bed. Monty was found murdered one morning, her beloved jewelry missing. Sadly, and in typically terror-stricken fashion, a Chinese man was charged with her murder. He denied having any part in the killing, but was executed by citizens anxious to see a conclusion to this brutal crime. Not long after, Monty's sometimes live-in boyfriend confessed to the murder. It is said that to this day you can hear her moans as Monty complains of the injustice surrounding her untimely death. Monica Field explained that the legend of Monty's ghost has become entrenched in the Frank folklore. 5 or 6 years ago, 2 young boys foolishly started to climb Turtle Mountain late on a Saturday. It got dark and they were stranded on the east face. They screamed for help, but it said their cries couldn't be heard over Monty's moans. The town of Frank's neighbor, Bellevue, was hit with a disaster in 1910. A spontaneous gas explosion killed 30 young men working in the coal mine. When describing the ominous and oppressive feeling of the area, Monica Field included the Bellevue mine as well. 4 years later, Hillcrest, Alberta made the front pages of newspapers all over Canada. 189 miners lost their lives in Canada's worst single coal mining disaster. The mine continued to function as a viable commercial enterprise until 1949, despite a similar occurrence in 1926. Thankfully, only 2 men were killed that time. A month later, the mine and the miners were working again. It remained an active and profitable coal mine until it was dynamited shut due only to the dwindling demand for coal. There has been little altered around the Hillcrest coal mine. It hasn't been sanitized at all, explained Interpreter Field. Frequently take groups of school children there. Every time I do, I can feel the presence of those miners and their families. I can feel the men's disbelief and the agony of the families waiting at the entrance to the mine. Few people can visit the area and come away unmoved. This is one instance where it is unquestionably the area and not the individual that's haunted. Prehistoric beasts return to Drumheller. The unique landscape of Alberta's Badlands around Drumheller is a treasure for scientists. Millions of years ago, the area was a tropical jungle where dinosaurs roamed, feeding on lush vegetation. Apparently, the world's climate cooled. The jungles that had been the food supply for the mammoth reptiles withered, and the huge beasts became extinct. The legacy of both the animal and the vegetable life remains in a form of fossils, of dinosaur bones and rich coal seams. For the first 50 years of this century, hardworking miners dug their way underground to exploit these coal reserves. Jake Halliday was one of those miners. For many years, Jake was employed by the Atlas coal mine in East Coulee, 13 miles southeast of Drumheller. A conscientious employee, Jake soon rose through the ranks to the position of machine boss, responsible for repairs to all electrical, mechanical, and welding equipment. On April 10, 1948, Jake had gone down to the mine on his day off. There was work that needed to be completed before full production began on Monday morning. I remember the date clearly, Jake said. It was exactly 1 week before my 26th birthday. I was doing some welding, but it wasn't progressing as fast as I had hoped. I stopped welding for a moment while I contemplated my next move. The only noise in the mine was the whine of the AC-driven arc welder. Suddenly, over the noise of the welder, I heard a distant thud, then another and another, Jake continued. It sounded like the footsteps of a heavy animal. I shut down the welder so that I could listen to the noise more clearly. The thudding noise continued and seemed to be getting much closer to the machine shop where I was. That was 3 miles underground. Jake was terrified. Chills ran up his spine, and he could feel the hair on the nape of his neck stand on end. When he saw hundreds of mice fleeing towards the entrance, he panicked. Mining lore holds that mice have a sixth sense and can detect impending disaster. When he heard the mine's support timbers creaking and snapping, he fled for his life. As I traveled toward the outside, I kept turning my head to see if anything was following me out. There were only mice. Once I reached the outside, I breathed a lot easier. The nightmare was over. Amazingly, the next day, Jake headed back underground and worked undisturbed until the job was completed. I did not mention the incident to anyone, he confirmed. It was 40 years later before he allowed himself to mentally relive the ghosts of the dinosaurs pounding in the strata above him. I was researching my book, he explained. I came to the location of that mine entrance. It had been dynamited closed. I paused and had many lingering thoughts of the incident that had occurred on April 10th, 1948. Medicine's Hat's Phantom Train. The story of Medicine's Hat Ghost Train is deeply ingrained in the city's history. You would be hard-pressed to find an adult resident of the southern city who is not well aware of the legend. tale even rated its own chapter when local historians compiled and published the area's local history. Bob Tuhey and Gus Day worked for the Canadian Pacific Railway, Bob as an engineer and Gus as a fireman. On a fine June morning in 1908, the two men were busy with their duties as the train they were operating made its way from Medicine Hat to Dunmore. Suddenly, another train appeared. It was approaching theirs. The two trains were traveling on a single track in opposite directions, and there could only be one result. Engineer Tuhey made for the gangplank to jump to safety, and he called to his partner to do the same. In a final attempt to avert disaster, Fireman Day grabbed for the brake handle before joining Tuhey. The approaching train sounded a warning whistle, and both men stood frozen in fear. With eyes like saucers, the railway men watched in disbelief as their engine passed the second train. The coach windows were lighted, and crew members waved greeting from places where crew members would have been expected to be found, waving greetings as trains passed one another. The inevitable head-on crash never occurred. The approaching train had not, after all, been traveling on the same track as Day and Tuhey's. It had sped smoothly along beside the scheduled one on non-existent tracks. Day and Tuhey were badly shaken by the incident. By silent agreement, neither man spoke of the terrifying sighting. A full 2 weeks passed before they dared mention it even to one another. Once they had, though, both were somewhat relieved. At least each knew their own mind had not concocted the apparition. Prior to seeing the phantom train, Bob Tuhey had visited a fortune teller. She indicated that, despite his good health, within a month he'd be dead. The man put the two incidents together and wisely decided to take some time off. An engineer named Jay Nicholson took Tuhey's place as Gus Day's partner. All went well for several days. The ghost train memory was beginning to fade in Day's mind until, at exactly the same spot they'd passed, the mystery train earlier in that month, Day heard his new workmate exclaim, "What the hell's that?" The terrified men stared intently at the train hurtling towards them on their track. Seconds before the inevitable crash occurred, the other train veered slightly. With its whistle sounding and headlight beaming, the phantom train once again passed safely beside the scheduled one. In keeping with railway courtesy, the crew members of the second train waved greetings to Nicholson and Day. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary to that crew, despite the fact their train was gliding along non-existent tracks. Gus Day reported for his shift on July 8, 1908. He was assigned to yard duty. The position of fireman on the route to Dunmore was taken by a man named Thompson. Engineer for the trip was Jay Nicholson. They were to pick up the Spokane Flyer at Dunmore and take it further east to Swift Current, Saskatchewan. As the train Nicholson and Thompson were charged with operating made its way along the route, it inevitably came to the spot where the phantom train had been seen. Again, an oncoming train was sighted. This time, it was real. Passenger train 514 from Lethbridge was heading towards the eastbound freight. Thompson jumped clear moments before the grinding collision. He was the only crew member to survive. Passenger train crewmen Gray and Mollett, as well as 7 passengers, were killed on the westbound train, as was Thompson's partner, Nicholson. In an investigation after the crash, Thompson recalled seeing a farmer standing on a hill, waving frantically. At the time, the crews interpreted the wave only as being a friendly greeting. In fact, it was intended as a warning. From his perch, the man had a clear view of the impending disaster. What a tragedy that neither the farmer's warning nor that of the phantom train had been understood. After all, both engineers had seen both warnings. The engineer of the westbound train that fateful morning was Bob Tuhey. Heavy with spirits. Wayne, formerly Rosedeer, Alberta, is a ghost town. How fitting, then, that it is haunted. Once it was a bustling metropolis of over 3,000 hard-living souls. Today, Fred Damon, the owner and operator of the Last Chance Saloon in the Rosedeer Hotel, is one of only a couple of dozen remaining residents. The hotel has been in Fred's family for 45 years, and he was raised in it. If anyone's in town, whether they're ghostly or warm-blooded, it is a fair bet that Fred will know about them. The Last Chance Saloon is as unique as its proprietor and its ghost town location. Draft beer is served in jars, and Fred can always be counted on to provide local color. Although he's never seen the hotel's ghost, he has heard the apparition and felt its presence. As any good innkeeper would, Fred's also kept careful track of strange reports from his guests over the years. He took time one summer afternoon to explain the history of the town. This was a tough area. It was coal mining country. There were the workers, the unions, the communists, and the Ku Klux Klan. Certainly not a situation conducive to building a serene neighborhood. In the 1920s, the Klan tarred and feathered a fellow up on the 3rd floor. It's been closed off for years now. Even today, people don't like to go near it. It seems, though, that some people just can't leave well enough alone. A woman who was staying in the hotel told Fred she could point out the exact room where the torture took place. She found the ominous atmosphere particularly concentrated around one room. It's not just the hotel and the bar that are haunted in what remains of Wayne, Alberta. The whole area is heavy with spirit, Fred remarked. There was an Indian camp and graveyard nearby. There have been problems with ghosts there too. Not surprisingly, when the town was in its heyday, there were more demonstrative difficulties. The proximity of the free-living young coal miners to the exotic Indian maidens created predictable hostilities. The men would slim down their wallets and fatten up their courage at the last chance. The Indian men did not take kindly to drunk white men pursuing their women. More than a few miners' bodies were found in Rosebud Creek. When Fred was a teenager, he and his friends partied regularly in that area. Tradition came to an abrupt halt when one young couple, who were parked no doubt to enjoy the moonlit evening, heard a tremendous thump on the side of their car. They were significantly jolted by the noise to stop what they were doing and investigate. There was no one near their car, but there were footprints leading to the car door where the thump was heard. No footprints led away from the car. It was assumed then, and it continues to be now, that the disturbance was caused by either an Indian spirit or that of a coal miner who once caroused too courageously. On the outskirts of town and high up on a hill, there is a graveyard. It hasn't been used since 1938, Fred reported. It is full. Is it full then? No. There's lots of space left, but there's no road leading up to it. You can't drive there, you have to walk. It was difficult for burials, so people started using the graveyard in Drumheller. Then the town began to die and the old graveyard became abandoned. That certainly sounds like a perfect scenario for at least one ghost. Although in the last few years, a few people have requested that their ashes be scattered around the countryside. No one has gone up to the old cemetery for years. Perhaps those who are resting there do not wish to be disturbed. Priest watches over his mission. The Lac La Biche mission accompanies the same site it did when originally established in 1855 by the missionary Oblates. The contributions the mission made to the settlement of the province was significant. It housed the first printing press, the first sawmill, and the first convent, and the mission grew the first commercial wheat crops. The stone foundations from the convent were unearthed by archaeologists in 1990. In 1920, a tornado swept across the Lac La Biche countryside, flattening buildings for miles around. The church and many other buildings on the mission site were completely destroyed. Amazingly, the church's altar was left untouched and sits today in the new church, constructed in 1921. Services continued to be conducted from this altar. Past and present congregations regard its very existence as a miracle. The other buildings on the site today include the new convent, built in 1890, and the rectory, which, like the church, was built after the tornado. The mission is a museum open for the public to enjoy. It is well staffed with well-informed interpreters. Some of the staff know stories about the place that'll never be written up in history books. A young lady who asked to be called Jane is one of those who remember. In 1989, 3 of us were working in and around the rectory. We'd frequently see the reflection of a person in one of the windows. We'd go check it out, and there'd be nothing there. This happened 4 or 5 times before we finally got used to it. I never felt worried about it. Whoever or whatever the reflection belonged to obviously didn't want to bother the young people working, or be bothered itself. He looked to me to be a sad old man. He appeared most often on gloomy days that were overcast with clouds. Could the weather conditions have created the illusions the young people were witnesses to? Carrie MacDonald was a tour guide at the mission in 1982. During her tenure, she had experiences that supported Jane's story. "Oh yes, I've seen the ghost in the rectory," she confided, "and I've heard about him from others too." While working at cleaning the grounds behind the rectory, the staff would frequently get the feeling they were being watched. This bothered them because they knew they were the only ones on the property. It wasn't long before they noticed the image of a man standing, staring at them from out a window. We went in the building and up to the attic to check it out. There was nothing there. But we'd all seen the same man, a priest. We hightailed it out of the building. Once sensitized to the existence of the priestly ghost, Carrie and her workmates kept their ears open for others with similar stories. Their attentions were rewarded. Actors from the play Norse Song that was put on here also said they'd seen the ghost. Some said they seen him watching them as they woke up. One person told me he noticed an open window and went to shut it. When he looked back, the window was open again, and a priest was sitting by it reading a newspaper. When a mission reunion was held, Carrie's experiences were further confirmed. Former students were full of ghost story. The priest was a consistent figure throughout them all. A couple who were staying at the convent during the reunion reported that they could get close to each other, but could not touch. Can the energy of chastity remain in a building? I've always really liked the convent, although I did see an image in a 3rd floor window there one time, Carrie remembered. People frequently asked Carrie how she could even go into the buildings after so many frightening reports and experiences. Each one of us sort of adopted a room and took special care of that particular area. I think that the spirits knew we weren't doing any harm and that we were fixing the place up. She continued describing how she felt protected by what she and her peers had been doing. "I've scrubbed every inch of the walls in the drawing room," she said, and then added with a lilt in her voice, "Sure, it's eerie, even to this day, but it's also fun comparing stories with all the others." Keeping watch, Kilmore Lodge is nestled inside the gates of beautiful Waterton Park. Leslie Musa, owner of the lodge, is a warm and welcoming woman who thoroughly enjoys her niche in the area's tourist trade. Her extensive knowledge of local history, and particularly the history of Kilmore Lodge itself, is a bonus for guests. Without too much prompting, Leslie may even entertain you with stories of their resident ghost. We call her Miss Kilmore. Leslie explained in a matter-of-fact way. We don't know exactly who she is, or was. Possibly she's one of the former owners of the place. Leslie's never seen Miss Kilmore, but she's felt her presence many times. She's even witnessed some of the apparition's hijinks. This is a very old building, and repairs and renovations are a frequent necessity, the proprietor explained. Over the years, and as the building's use and owners changed, there's have been major alterations. This is our 6th season with the lodge, and I can tell you Miss Kilmore doesn't like the renovations. They really upset her, and she becomes quite active. Over the years, the lady has frequently been known to cause lights to turn on and off, swinging doors open and close, apparently of their own volition, and other doors to slam closed for no apparent reason. Leslie chuckled as she recalled a slightly off-the-wall stunt the ghost pulled. Potatoes. She piled all the potatoes in the middle of the kitchen floor. Leslie is not the only brunt of the lady's tricks. One morning, our waitress supervisor was preparing the first pot of breakfast coffee for our guests. She went to set the pot on the element, and it flew across the room. She was annoyed at first because she assumed the coffee machine's element had been left on all night, and the cold pot's contact with the hot surface had caused the accident. Not so. The element was turned off. The surface was not even warm, let alone hot. Occasionally guests will tell Leslie that they felt a woman's presence. One couple were visiting from Los Angeles. In the morning, the man told me he had a sensation of a woman leaning over the bed, staring at him. He said it wasn't a frightening or uncomfortable experience at all, just an awareness. Several years ago, we had a guest who was apparently psychic. As soon as she walked in, she said to me, "Do you know this building is home to a spirit?" It was information from the sensitive visitor that confirmed much of what Leslie had been suspected about their supernatural border. She assured me that the ghost had a passive nature and was indeed a female, an older woman. You know, I'm not sure to this day whether the psychic actually saw her or just felt a suggestion of her. Whichever it was, the description the psychic guest gave was detailed. A passive spirit of a white-haired woman in her 60s or 70s wearing a blue floral dress. Apparently, she has a chair by the front door. These bits of information were all additional indications to Leslie about the woman's identity. She continued, in the early days of the lodge, a woman owned and ran the place by herself. I gather from what I've read and heard over the years that the men in the area gave her a pretty rough time. The industry here is strictly tourism, and it can be very competitive. I talked to a man who had boarded with her when he was a youth. He said she was a good businesswoman who was just keeping her ground. I'm sure there's more to the story than we'll ever know. You're dealing with the dynamics of business people in a small community. Perhaps Miss Kilmore will eventually accept the inevitable and ongoing renovations at the Kilmore Lodge. If she does, she might perhaps enjoy just sitting forever in her blue floral print dress by the front door and keeping a kindly watch over Kilmore's Lodge current owners and guests. East Coulee's resident who never ages. In 1928, East Coulee and the towns surrounding it were booming. The area is rich with coal, and in the early 1900s, the fuel is very much in demand. One of the last mines to close was the Atlas mine. It was still operational less than 50 years ago. The Atlas mine was owned and operated by the Patrick family. The business was currently a successful one, but sadly, the family had experienced a great tragedy. In 1928, when little Billy Patrick was only 2 years old, he wandered away from his yard where he and his dog had been happily playing. Despite an intensive search, the townspeople were not able to find Billy. The poor dog appeared several hours later, soaked to the bone and limping badly. Unfortunately, the bedraggled mutt had no way of communicating his experience with the frantic searchers. The hunt for Billy continued, but no trace of him was ever found. It was generally accepted that he had drowned. Despite the longevity of the mining operation, the intervening years were not kind to East Coulee. For many years, the place was considered virtually a ghost town. Its population had dipped to well below 100. Only recently, some of the long empty houses have started to fill up again. People are finding that the price of real estate in a ghost town is appealing, and now the population is up to a bustling 250 souls. Or should that be 251? The house where Billy Patrick lived during his short existence still stands. In the 1980s, it was owned by a family with 3 children who could sense the presence of a small boy. They said that sometimes he would come to play with them. Carol Stewart of East Coulee explained. Whenever the family left the house, the children maintained they could see the boy's image at a window. The little waif would watch the family as they left the house. To assure the lad, the youngsters took to waving goodbye to him. The children's parents never saw the child, but they did report that they may have heard the pitter-patter of footsteps when they knew their own children were in bed fast asleep. As a precaution, the mother arranged to have the house exorcised. It's likely that the exorcism was a success, but no one knows for sure because the family moved away not long after the ritual had been performed. The next family to move into Billy's old house didn't have children, and if they occasionally had a strange visitor, they never mentioned it to their friends in the community. Today, the house is a home to children once again. Carol Stewart indicated that the new owners have never mentioned anything out of the ordinary. Perhaps little Billy Patrick has finally gone to his eternal rest, or perhaps the new owner's children just aren't ready to share information about their special playmate with anyone as boring as an adult. 2 tales from small towns. Ghost stories are all supposed to have occurred many years ago and in exotic locations. This one, however, took place in April of 1992 in the town of Lamont, Alberta. A woman drove out to see her mother in Lamont. The 2 chatted happily for a while, and the daughter noted how well her mother seemed. The younger woman had some errands, so she left to get these done before she drove back home. While walking along the street, the daughter saw a man coming toward her. She stood still and stared at the approaching figure in utter shock. It was her father, and he had died years before. When he came within a few feet of her, he spoke. "I have come to take your mother home," he explained. That night, the woman's mother fell and was taken to the hospital. After examining the woman, the doctor said she was fine and could go home the next day. The following morning, she died from complications caused by the fall. Due south of Lamont lies Tofield, Alberta. It is one of a string of small towns along Highway 14 and the railway tracks that run parallel to it. South and east of Edmonton, Tofield is not too far from Viking, hometown of the National Hockey League's Sutter brothers. This story, like some others, was frustrating to try to nail down. The people involved were no longer willing to talk about their strange experiences by the time they were contacted. The message was relayed to me this way: "I have a hard enough time talking about this to my friends. I'm certainly not going to discuss it with a stranger." The following story, though, had already been told to me by a young woman I've known for years. She knows the Tofield family and never imagined they'd be unwilling to share their experiences. The family in question consists of a husband, wife, and 2 children, who had settled into their newly purchased Tofield home easily. Nothing seemed amiss until the day the husband was sitting in his living room watching television. A movement in the periphery of his vision distracted him from the show he'd been enjoying. Looking toward the movement, the man was most startled to see someone in his living room. Worse, this man was not the clean-cut sort who might have been welcome. The uninvited visitor was, judging by his clothes and rather unkempt appearance, a motorcycle gang member. The startled homeowner had a few seconds to assess the half-Wellington boots, blue jeans, helmet, and requisite black leather jacket. Then the image was gone. It had walked through a wall and out of sight. The man jumped up from where he'd been sitting and hurried via the doorway to the adjacent room. And then another, until he checked the whole house thoroughly. The biker was nowhere to be found. The man was as alone in his house as he had presumed he was. Despite this, his composure was understandably shaken. Since that first incident many years ago, the biker had used the family's home as a route to wherever he had to get on several occasions. Even in life, a motorcycle gang member can prove an intimidating sight. The ghost of one would be even more startling a vision. For this family, though, that's no longer the case. They're used to his forays through their home. Not only is the ghost not menacing, he seems oblivious to the family's existence. Who says life in small-town Alberta is boring?